Christmas Eve 1887, snow fell
我
heavy
得走
over the
了，
Wyoming
照顾好自
territory,
己。
the sky pouring white over the open land until fences vanished and roads blurred, and in a small cabin lonesome against that winter, Daniel Mercer stood at a frost-covered window, watching the empty trail disappear into the storm, while his 6-year-old daughter Lucy carefully arranged pine cones on the rough-hewn table and hummed a Christmas carol her mother used to sing before fever carried her away 2 years earlier, leaving him with a child to raise and a heart so wounded it had forgotten how to feel anything but duty. If you want to see what happens when a man frozen by grief orders a bride, he swears he will never love, and that woman arrives on Christmas Eve with nothing but her courage and her character, then stay with this story to the very end. And before we ride deeper into the snowstorm of Daniel's choices, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who loves emotional frontier stories, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale. Lucy's small voice broke through the thick silence that had settled over the cabin like a second blanket as she asked whether Daniel thought she would come today. Her hopeful eyes turned toward the window while his jaw tightened at the reminder of the decision he had made 3 months earlier when he answered a mail-order advertisement, not from any spark of hope or desire, but from a grim sense of duty because his daughter needed a woman's presence. The homestead needed help, and he needed someone who would not expect a heart he no longer believed he had to give. He told her that the stage was due at noon, and that if the woman was coming, she would be on it, his words as flat as the frozen plain, while Lucy bounced on her heels, dreaming aloud that the stranger might be kind and pretty and fond of Christmas, and Daniel, unwilling to feed those tender wishes, kept his own hopes brutally practical, imagining a sturdy, sensible woman who would not ask for romance or charm, only honest work and a roof that held against the wind. The cabin's quiet was shattered by a sudden knock that sounded almost shocking against the log walls, and Lucy gasped that she must be there, while Daniel felt his boots grow heavier with every step towards the door, his hand pausing on the latch as he pulled a single breath into lungs that had forgotten how to draw hope. And then he opened it to a world of swirling snow and the sight of a woman who did not match any picture he had allowed himself to imagine. She stood on the small porch with snow in her dark hair, her dress threadbare and patched in more than one place, her shoes worn through at the toes and wrapped with cloth in a desperate attempt to keep out the cold, a single carpet bag clutched so tightly in her gloveless hands that her knuckles had gone white, and although her face was pale from the hard journey, her eyes were dark and steady and held no trace of shame, which made Daniel's stomach drop because this was not what he had expected and not what his pride would have chosen, yet it was precisely what his daughter had just prayed would arrive. She spoke his name like a mixture of question and quiet prayer. "Mr. Mercer, I am Claire, your bride." And before Daniel could even decide what to say, Lucy squeezed past his legs with the bright certainty only a child can carry, exclaiming that Claire was cold and insisting that her father let the woman in, while Daniel stood there staring at the worn fabric and thin shoes and all the obvious poverty, his first instinct not born of cruelty but of fear, because he wondered what kind of life, what desperate circumstances had driven this woman through snow and judgment to his doorstep. The winter wind howled between them, and hurled snowflakes across the threshold like scattered promises that might or might not be kept. And while Daniel hesitated, Lucy was already reaching for the stranger's hand as if the matter were already settled. So Claire stepped over the threshold into his cabin, and as the snowflakes melted on her patched shoulders like quiet tears, she carried herself with such calm dignity, her back straight and her chin level, that Daniel noticed there was no apology at all in the way she occupied the space he had sworn belonged only to ghosts. Lucy tugged at his sleeve, insisting that Claire was frozen and needed hot coffee immediately. And although Daniel tried to rein in his daughter with a warning, the child was already pulling Claire toward the fire, proudly telling her to sit in the warmest chair because her papa had built the fireplace himself and was very good at building things. So Claire allowed herself to be guided, sank into the chair, and for just a heartbeat her composure slipped, exhaustion and relief crossing her face before she gathered the pieces of herself again and thanked Lucy with a voice gentler than Daniel had expected, telling the child she had her father's kind heart, a statement that nearly made him laugh because he had not believed his heart kind in 2 aching years. Lucy disappeared into the little kitchen corner and returned with a chipped cup of coffee that Daniel recognized instantly as Rebecca's cup, the one his late wife had refused to throw away because she said the crack and missing bit of handle gave it character, and with solemn ceremony Lucy offered it to Claire, explaining that it had been Mamma's favorite, which made Claire's hands tremble slightly as she accepted it and say that she was honored to use it, then drink deeply while the color began to return slowly to her cheeks. And Daniel watched from the doorway with his arms crossed, saying nothing, telling himself he should ask about her circumstances and inquire about her journey. Yet instead he simply studied her in silence. He noticed the careful way every patch had been stitched on her dress, each one precise and neat despite the rough cloth, the way she held the cup with both hands like someone who understood the worth of warmth, and the steadiness in her gaze when she finally looked up and caught him watching, which led her to say quietly that she understood this was not what he had expected, and he admitted it was not, while she did not flinch or drop her eyes, but offered to explain her circumstances if he would allow it, a conversation he abruptly postponed by telling Lucy to show Miss Clare to the spare room so she could rest after her journey, his tone harsher than he intended. Lucy beamed, proudly declaring that she had helped her father clean the room, especially for Claire. And as their voices faded down the hallway, Daniel turned back to the window where the snow fell harder now, quickly covering any tracks on the road, and he realized with a cold jolt that if he meant to send this woman back, he would need to decide quickly before the trail became impassable and his choice vanished beneath the drifts. Yet from the spare room he could hear Lucy's bright chatter and Claire's patient replies, and then something he had not heard in months, his daughter's laughter, bright and free, as if some shutter had finally been opened in her small heart. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides, while Lucy's laughter echoed through the cabin like a ghost returning to life, and he told himself he would give Claire shelter for one night, that he would allow her to stay through Christmas, and then he would decide what to do. But even as he made that bargain with his pride, he knew something had already shifted inside him, in a way he did not yet fully understand. If you have ever watched someone fight with their own heart like this, torn between pride and what they plainly see, and you want to know whether Daniel chooses the woman at his fire or the gossip in town, then keep watching. And if you are feeling this tension building, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who loves slow burn frontier romance, and subscribe so you do not miss how this story turns. Evening settled over the cabin like a heavy wool blanket that kept the worst of the cold at bay while muffling sound, the wind dropping to low whispers outside as the fire inside crackled its steady rhythm, and Lucy sat at the table showing Claire her small collection of bird feathers, explaining which ones Papa had found by the creek and which ones she had discovered in the yard, while Daniel retreated to the kitchen under the excuse of preparing supper, though in truth he sought distance, even as every word they exchanged reached him clearly. Lucy asked if Claire would help her hang her Christmas stocking, because Mamma had always helped, and Claire's answer came warm and certain as she agreed and asked where it should go. So Daniel paused with his hands on the bread knife and listened to the scrape of a chair, heard Lucy's eager directions and Claire's gentle cooperation, and when he finally allowed himself to step into the main room, he saw them by the fireplace, Lucy on tiptoe while Claire steadied her so she could hang a small knitted stocking from a nail, Claire declaring it perfect, Lucy stepping back with shining eyes, and then that devastating honesty only children wield as Lucy confided that her papa did not smile any more, not since Mamma had gone to heaven. Daniel's chest tightened as Lucy explained in a soft, conspiratorial whisper that her father used to smile all the time, but now only worked and worried, and he knew he should interrupt, should spare the stranger such confession, but his feet refused to move, so he watched as Claire knelt to Lucy's height, took the child's small hands in her own, and spoke words that struck him like scripture, saying that grief is love with nowhere to go, and that his heart was still full of love for his daughter, that sometimes when people lose someone precious, they forget how to show the love that remains, yet it is still there and visible in everything they do. Lucy thought about this with furrowed brow, then asked if Claire believed her papa would remember how to smile again, and Claire told her that little girls who ask brave questions often help their fathers remember important things, which sent Daniel back into the kitchen with his throat burning, where he finished supper with mechanical efficiency, while his thoughts churned harder than the winter wind. When he called them to eat, he kept his eyes mostly on his plate and spoke only when necessary, the old armor snapping back into place, and after supper Claire insisted on washing the dishes, her hands moving with practiced care, while Daniel took Lucy to bed, listened to her prayers, and kissed her forehead, before returning to find that Claire had not only cleaned every plate, but mended Lucy's torn stocking, the one his daughter had snagged earlier that day, and when Claire looked up from her needle to say she hoped he did not mind, that she had simply noticed the tear, he replied that it was fine. His voice clipped, then grabbed his coat and escaped into the barn. The cold outside hit him like punishment, and he welcomed the sting, standing in the dark barn, gripping the workbench where he had once carved toys for Lucy and shaped the cradle Rebecca had loved so fiercely, his hands still for 2 long years, his heart even more so while through the small window he saw the cabin glowing with lamplight, a woman in rags tending his home with more care than he had offered it, his daughter smiling inside while he hid out in a freezing barn, asking the darkness what he had done and hearing no answer but his own ragged breath. When he finally returned to the cabin, the fire was banked carefully and a lamp left burning low, a small gesture of consideration that felt oddly intimate, and beside the fireplace Lucy's mended stocking hung whole and neat, drawing Daniel's gaze and making him feel, for the first time in 2 years, the full weight of his loneliness, not as a fixed sentence, but as something that might possibly be changed. Christmas morning arrived bright and bitterly cold, sunlight turning the deep snow into glittering fields of diamonds. And Lucy woke first, her excited footsteps pattering across the floor as Daniel listened from his bed, and then heard her delighted gasp from the front room, which sent him quickly to the fireplace, where he found her clutching her stocking with both hands and staring in wonder at a small wooden bird she had pulled from inside, carved from a scrap of kindling, yet shaped so delicately that its wings and turned head seemed almost alive. Claire emerged from the spare room, still wearing her threadbare dress, though her hair had been neatly brushed and pinned, and smiled softly at Lucy's joy, naming the little bird as a chickadee, one of those brave creatures that stays through winter when others fly south, while Lucy hugged the carving to her chest and asked in awe if Claire had made it, and when Claire admitted she had and hoped Lucy liked it, the child flung her arms around Claire's waist in fierce gratitude, thanking her over and over, while over Lucy's head Claire's eyes sought Daniel's, uncertain whether she had overstepped, and he forced himself to nod and acknowledge that the gesture had been kind. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm in which Claire rose early and had coffee ready when Daniel came in from morning chores, tended the cabin with quiet competence, checked drafts around the windows, organized the pantry, and stretched their limited provisions with a skill that told of hard years, while Lucy shadowed her constantly and asked to learn how to make biscuits, how to sew a straight seam, and what Missouri, Claire's home, had been like, and Daniel, who tried to keep his distance, could not help noticing that the cabin felt markedly less empty, that Lucy's nightmares had ceased, and that Claire's presence seemed to fill hollows he had not realized existed. One evening Lucy brought Daniel a small sampler she had been working on under Claire's guidance, the stitching uneven but earnest, spelling out the words, "Home is where love grows," and proudly announced that Miss Claire had helped with the harder letters, and said Lucy had patient hands like Mamma had, which made Daniel look first at the sampler and then at his daughter's hopeful face and admit that it was fine work, while the mention of Rebecca no longer brought only pain but a complicated mixture of sorrow and gratitude, because he could not deny that Claire was honoring his late wife's memory by tending the child they both loved. That night, after Lucy was asleep, Daniel found himself at his long-neglected workbench, reaching for carving tools that had gathered dust for 2 years, and almost without conscious thought, he began to shape a small block of pine, his hands slowly remembering how to coax form from rough wood until a simple flower emerged, its 5 petals and curved stem a bit rough, not his best work but honest, and although he told himself He had carved it for Lucy. When he set it aside, he found himself wondering whether Claire, with her careful patches and steady gaze, would find beauty in its imperfections. The second week of January brought dry, bitter cold under a clear blue sky, and Daniel rode to the north pasture to check on the cattle, leaving Claire and Lucy to their domestic routine. When he returned at dusk, he found them at the table with heads bent over Lucy's primer, as Claire encouraged the child to sound out words and praised her warmly when she read freedom correctly. And during supper, Lucy nodded off on the rug before the fire, exhausted from her lessons, so Daniel carried her to bed while Claire cleaned the kitchen, and when he returned, he found her mending near the dying fire, her needle moving with that same patient grace that seemed to touch everything she did. He knew he should keep his distance, should go straight to bed and maintain the careful walls he had built. Yet instead he poured himself coffee and sat in the chair opposite her, the silence between them stretched and expectant, until he finally broke it by remarking that she had been a teacher in Missouri, and after a brief pause she confirmed that she had, before he asked, in a halting way, how someone who had once stood at a schoolhouse front had come to answer his advertisement and arrive in such obvious poverty, a question she finished for him without bitterness, her gaze level, as she began to explain. Claire told him that her father had been a respected merchant in their town and that she had been educated and taught school for 3 years, but when he died the previous spring, she discovered he had left only debts behind. She sold their house, furniture, her mother's jewelry, everything to pay what he owed, and though she kept her integrity, she lost her position when it was given to a married woman because a widow without family ties was considered unsuitable in that community. So with no family left to help and no prospects appearing, she saw his advertisement in the St. Louis paper, a widower with a child seeking a partner for frontier life, and chose to answer honestly. She could have borrowed fine clothes and pretended prosperity to make herself more appealing, she said, but she refused to build a life on deception, believing that he deserved to know exactly who stood before him, a woman who had lost every material comfort, yet refused to surrender her honor. And Daniel found himself sitting back in silence, struck by the fact that she had chosen truth over advantage at a moment when desperation might have excused lies, a choice that reminded him sharply of the fierce integrity his late wife had possessed. He told her that what she had done took more courage than most men he knew, and something in her expression softened at the acknowledgement. A small easing of the guard she held around herself, and although they moved back into silence after that, it settled differently, less like a wall and more like a shared space where understanding might grow. The next day Lucy fell while playing in the yard and cut her knee on a stone, and before Daniel could react, Claire was there, calm and sure, cleaning the wound with efficient, gentle hands and soothing Lucy's tears with soft words until the child was laughing about her battle scar, and Daniel watched with a tight throat, realizing that this woman in patched clothing possessed more worth than many who strutted through town in finery, a realization that deepened later that night when he left the carved wooden flower on the kitchen table and found it gone in the morning, then spotted it on Claire's windowsill catching the winter light, displayed like something precious, though neither of them mentioned it aloud. The third week of January brought Daniel into town for supplies, the wagon's iron wheels crunching over packed snow while his breath clouded in the air, and the general store, bright and crowded with townsfolk escaping the cold, had barely swallowed him when Widow Carson descended with a practiced smile and a small cloud of gossips at her back, remarking that word had reached them about his mail-order bride, and asking with poisonous sweetness whether it was true the woman had arrived in rags on Christmas Eve. Daniel replied carefully that Claire's circumstances had been modest, but the widow clucked her tongue and lamented that a man of his standing, whose late wife Rebecca had been from a good family, ought to have found someone with means, and another woman chimed in to wonder what kind of breeding produced such poverty, insisting that Claire must have been truly desperate, and that what he had done was practically charity, then questioning what people would say and what example this set for his daughter, all while their words burrowed under Daniel's skin like splinters. He paid for his supplies and left quickly, but the ride home felt longer than the miles, as their voices echoed in his mind, repeating what kind of breeding, and truly desperate, and practically charity, and he found himself suddenly seeing Claire through their cruel lens, her clothing shabbier, her lack of possessions glaring, the doubt creeping in like a draught through a cracked window, whispering that perhaps he had been foolish, and that maybe he was exposing Lucy to someone unsuitable in the eyes of the community he still cared about more than he liked to admit. When he arrived home, Claire and Lucy were in the kitchen, dusted with flour, laughing as they shaped dough for cinnamon rolls, Lucy excitedly announcing that Miss Claire was teaching her a recipe from her grandmother, but Daniel's response came out flat and cool, enough to make Claire's smile fade as she sensed the shift, and over the next 2 days he withdrew further, taking meals in strained silence, avoiding her. Attempts at conversation, staying longer in the barn, and the careful warmth they had built began to freeze again, while Lucy's bright spirit dimmed, her chatter quieting as she watched her father with confused, wounded eyes. On the third evening, Daniel stood outside Lucy's bedroom door, about to enter for her bedtime prayers, when he heard her trembling voice as she asked Claire whether she was going to leave them too, the way Mama had, a question fraught with such childlike desperation that it cut through Daniel like winter wind, and he heard Claire answer gently that she was there now, that she was with Lucy, yet even the sleepy child heard the uncertainty wrapped inside those words. Daniel retreated to the barn, his heart a battlefield where the widow's words fought against what his own eyes had seen, where Claire's courage and kindness struggled with his pride and fear of judgment, and outside snow began to fall again, heavy and relentless, turning the land into a mirror of the storm inside him. Night deepened around the cabin, and he sat in the barn with moonlight laying silver bars across the floor, his father's old Bible resting on the workbench, where Sarah's, Rebecca's, ribbon still marked a page from 2 years before. He opened it with trembling hands and found, in the margin beside a verse, Rebecca's handwriting stating that worth is measured by character, not circumstance, a note she had written back when he had worried he was not providing enough, reminding him that his wife had always seen deeper than surfaces. He heard his father's voice in memory, saying that a man's measure was not in what he owned, but in what he was willing to give. And he asked himself what he was truly willing to give in this moment when he stood on the edge of either choosing the woman who had nothing but honor or the approval of those who measured everything by fabric and coin. From the cabin he heard faint sound drift across the cold yard, Claire's soft voice singing Lucy to sleep with a melody he did not recognize, but which carried such tenderness that his throat tightened, and he rose and crossed back to the house, moving quietly through the kitchen to the hallway, where he stopped in the shadows and watched. Claire sat beside Lucy's bed in her clean but threadbare dress, lamplight smoothing the lines of her face as she stroked the child's hair. Lucy's small hand locked around Claire's fingers in complete trust, and Lucy's sleepy voice asked again if Claire would go away like Mamma had, confessing her love with simple, raw honesty. And Claire leaned down to kiss her forehead, calling her little bird and telling her to hush because she was there, right there, and for the moment that was true, even if doubt tried to pull her away. As Daniel watched them, everything became terribly clear. This woman who owned nothing had chosen honesty when deceit would have served her, had given Lucy gentleness and safety without asking anything in return, had taken abuse from a town that did not know her and still answered with dignity. And he realized that Rebecca would have loved this woman, that Lucy already did, and that he himself had been measuring worth by the wrong scale entirely, listening to gossips instead of trusting his own eyes and the quiet wisdom left for him in the margins of his wife's Bible. He stepped back from the doorway, his decision crystallizing in his chest like ice forming on still water, clear and solid, and he told himself that tomorrow he would speak, that tonight he would not hide in the barn, but work there with purpose, preparing instead of fleeing. So he set his hands to carving until dawn, shaping the wooden flower again, this time with delicate leaves and a curved stem, smoothing it carefully until it shone with the care he had not allowed himself to give anything new in years. And beside it he laid a small box that held a simple ring, the one that had belonged to Rebecca's mother and that Rebecca had left, with a note for the next woman worthy of his heart whenever he found her. If this turning point, where a man finally chooses character over gossip and decides to fight for the woman everyone else looked down on, is hitting you in the chest, you are exactly the kind of heart I tell these stories for. So if you have not already, like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe so you stay with this family all the way to the end of their winter. Morning light poured through the cabin windows as Daniel stood at the stove, making breakfast with a focus he had not felt in years, coffee steaming in the pot while eggs sizzled in the pan and toast browned over the fire. And when he heard Claire's hesitant footsteps in the doorway and the surprise in her voice as she addressed him formally, he turned and asked her to sit because breakfast was almost ready, his tone gentler than it had been in days. She moved to the table cautiously, the weariness in her posture telling him that she had felt every inch of his recent withdrawal, and while her dignity remained, the tentative warmth that had been growing between them had clearly been bruised. So he set the food and coffee before her with care, then took the seat across from her and forced himself to meet her eyes as he began the apology he owed. He told her that when she had first arrived, he had looked at her and seen only rags, that he had listened to the town's gossip and heard judgment, and that he had failed to see what his daughter had recognized almost immediately, which was a woman of courage, integrity, and uncommon worth. Claire's expression flickered with something that might have been hope as she listened in silence, and he continued, saying that she could have come dressed in borrowed finery and pleasant lies, yet chose instead to come in truth, offering exactly who she was, and that this had taken more courage than anything most men would ever attempt. He confessed that Rebecca had died believing character mattered more than circumstance, and that he had nearly forgotten that lesson, then thanked Claire for reminding him, not with sermons, but with the way she lived in his cabin, and when he reached into his pocket to place the carved wooden flower on the table between them, followed by the small box, her hand stilled, her breath catching as if she sensed the shape of what was coming. Daniel told her that he had watched her these weeks, watched her kindness to Lucy, her dignity in hardship, her strength when facing judgment, and that he now saw her worth fully. He opened the box to reveal the simple ring and explained that it had belonged to his wife's mother and that Rebecca had left it for the next woman worthy of his heart, then said plainly that he chose Claire, not in spite of her circumstances, but because of who she had proven herself to be within them, because her poverty had not diminished her, but revealed her character when everything else was stripped away. He reached across the table and took her hand, their first intentional touch, feeling the warmth and slight tremble of her fingers in his, and asked if she would stay, not as an arrangement, but as family, not as an act of charity, but as someone chosen, not from obligation, but from something larger that he could not yet easily name, though she seemed to understand completely even without the word. Claire's composure broke as tears spilled down her cheeks, not of humiliation, but of being deeply seen, and she whispered yes, promising that she would stay and spend every day proving his trust well placed. And when Lucy's quick footsteps sounded in the hallway, and the child burst into the kitchen, having heard enough to grasp the meaning, she asked breathlessly whether this meant Claire would stay forever, whether it meant she would be her new mamma. And when Claire opened her arms, Lucy flew into them and sobbed with joy, then reached for her father's hand and pulled him into the circle. So the three of them stood wrapped together in the morning light, while Daniel felt his heart, long armored in grief, begin to beat with real hope again. Sunday came cold and clear, and Daniel helped Claire into the wagon, noting how she wore her threadbare dress with unshaken dignity, despite his offer to buy new clothes, an offer she had declined by saying that people should see clearly who he had chosen, and that there should be no deception, while Lucy sat proudly between them, holding both their hands as they rode toward town. At the church, the congregation turned as they walked down the aisle, whispers stirring like dry leaves, and after the service, Widow Carson approached with her sharpened smile. But before she could begin her slow, cutting remarks, Daniel addressed her loudly enough for the circle around them to hear, introducing Claire as his intended wife, and stating plainly that she had come to him with nothing but her character, and that he had found it worth more than any fortune he had ever known, which dropped a heavy silence over the yard. He added that if the town insisted on measuring worth by cloth rather than character, then the town had some learning yet to do. And then he offered Claire his arm, which she took with her head high, her dignity unshaken. For a long stretched moment no one moved until Mr. Thompson the blacksmith stepped forward, removed his hat, and bowed slightly to Claire, affirming that Daniel had spoken well, and saying that anyone with sense could recognize quality when it stood before them. The blacksmith's wife joined him and took Claire's hand warmly, inviting them for supper and assuring her their door was open, and one by one others followed. The banker's wife, the schoolmaster, even the reverend, until gossip began to give way to welcome. Judgment began to yield to genuine respect, and even the widow was forced to retreat behind a thin, brittle smile. The ride home felt lighter, Lucy chattering about the sermon, while glancing between Claire and Daniel with unconcealed delight, and as they turned into the homestead lane and the cabin came into view, Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop because something at the doorstep had caught his eye. When he helped Claire and Lucy down, Lucy spotted it first and cried out in wonder, racing to kneel beside the small cluster of flowers that had pushed up through the cold earth beside the steps. Purple and gold crocuses were opening bravely through the crust of snow, the same flowers Rebecca had planted years ago, and Lucy touched the delicate petals with reverence as she announced that Mama's flowers were coming back, while Claire knelt beside her and explained softly that the flowers had been there all along, waiting beneath the surface through the hardest freeze for warmth enough to let them bloom again. Daniel understood perfectly, realizing that hope does not die when love is lost, but waits like those bulbs under snow, patient and persistent, for someone brave enough to let it grow again, and he joined them on his knees in the snow, the three of them regarding the small flowers that stood brave and certain of the spring to come, before he rose and offered Claire his hand. She took it, her eyes meeting his with a trust that humbled him, and he told her, "Welcome home," words that carried the weight of a promise, to which she answered that she believed she was finally, truly home, her smile radiant despite the worn dress, beautiful because of the worth it framed rather than hid. And Lucy took Daniel's other hand so that together, where there had once been only two, three people stepped across the threshold into a cabin that had been a tomb of grief and was now becoming a living home. Inside, the fire burned warm, while on the table the carved wooden flower stood in a cup beside Rebecca's Bible, old love honoring new, and outside the winter sun broke fully through the clouds, flooding the land with golden promise as the crocuses stood guard by the door, purple and gold against white snow, proof that beauty survives even the harshest winter and that love can grow again in the most unlikely soil. Through the window, three silhouettes moved in the golden-lit cabin, a father, a daughter, and the woman chosen not in spite of her rags, but because of her radiant worth, and their laughter mingled with the crackling fire, filling spaces that had been empty for far too long, proving that home is not where you hang your hat, but where your heart finally learns to trust again. And on that Wyoming frontier, where winter slowly surrendered to spring and grief gradually yielded to hope, three hearts had found exactly that, because one man had been brave enough to open his door and choose character over pride, If this story of a broken man, a brave woman, and a little girl who refused to stop hoping warmed something in you, do not let it end here. Like this video so it reaches more hearts. Share it with someone who loves historical love stories and second chances. And subscribe to this channel so you can ride with us into the next frontier tale of loss, courage, and love that refuses to die.